Content note: this episode contains disturbing themes and graphic descriptions, so as such, listener discretion is advised. What manner of man is this? Or what manner of creature is it in the semblance of man? I feel the dread of this horrible place overpowering me. I am in fear, in awful fear, and there is no escape for me. I am encompassed about with terrors that I dare not think of. The words of Jonathan Harker, penned by Bram Stoker in Dracula, echo through the ages, capturing the essence of fear and dread that surrounds the vampire mythos. Yet as chilling as Stoker's tale may be, reality often proves to be even more disturbing. In the history of true crime, there exists a subset of killers whose deeds are steeped in the lore of the vampire, their actions a grotesque manifestation of delusion, obsession, and primal desire. Join us this week for a podcast where we delve into the darkest depths of human nature, true crime, mysteries, and the grim twists and turns of real-life events. This week I'm your host, Sarah. My co-host Marcus will be joining us later on for a discussion. Hello and welcome to Panopticon. This is Vampire Killers, Part 1, Rod Ferrell and the Murray Vampire Clan. In the annals of modern-day vampiric horror, few cases rival the chilling saga of Rod Ferrell, self-proclaimed leader of the Murray Vampire Clan. Born in Murray, Kentucky, Ferrell's upbringing was marred by the dissolution of his parents' marriage and the looming shadow of his mother, Sondra Gibson, a proponent of alternative lifestyles and a self-identified vampire advocate. It was within this tumultuous environment that Ferrell's descent into darkness began. As a teenager, Ferrell found solace in a community of like-minded individuals, forming a clan of youths who shared his fascination with vampirism. They congregated in graveyards under the cover of night, indulging in blood rituals and revelling in their perceived immortality. To Ferrell, vampirism was more than a mere fantasy. It was a pathway to power, to transcendence, and a means of escaping the mundane confines of mortal existence. From Interview with a Vampire, a YouTube interview conducted while Ferrell was incarcerated, Ferrell's delusions of grandeur are plain to see. Ferrell quotes of vampirism: "It equates life. It equates to power." But beneath this veneer of mystique lay a disturbing truth. Ferrell's upbringing was marked by trauma and abuse, the details of which he refused to divulge. Ferrell refused to discuss allegations that he may have been abused by his grandfather, but he did make reference to having witnessed rituals and sacrifices conducted by the adults around him growing up. These dark whispers of black masses and unspeakable acts haunted his past, driving him further into the embrace of his vampiric delusions. Once incarcerated, to his fellow inmates, Ferrell was known simply as the Count, a testament to his twisted obsession with the undead. Ferrell himself identified as Visago, a 500-year-old vampire at the time of his crimes. Ferrell had become obsessed with the role-playing game called Vampire the Masquerade, a game he was initially introduced to by his mother, Sondra. Ferrell went as far as tattooing the name on the nape of his neck. Visago, allegedly, was also a reference to a demon from scripture, although Ferrell was quick to separate vampirism from adjacent belief structures such as Satanism. According to Ferrell, Visago was an alleged sanguinary vampire, meaning he was a blood feeder. Rod Ferrell's crimes were committed in the 1990s in the heart of the American Bible Belt. One of Rod's peers, Jaden Murphy, claims to have been Ferrell's sire, the person that converted him to vampirism through the sharing of blood. Ferrell, having been raised in a somewhat alternative environment already, made friends with other misfit kids. Before long, a group of the teens began living together, forming a clan. For some, vampirism was merely an alternative lifestyle. For others, it was more akin to a religious cult. Ferrell claimed the clan would gather in graveyards at night to drink blood from willing donors, submissive types who would seek out dominant people. These people were referred to as blood dogs, or valius, which means herd animals. It wasn't long, however, before tensions arose within the group. Differences in opinion led to infighting. 1996 was a year marked by turmoil and betrayal within the Murray vampire clan. As tensions simmered, Ferrell, at that stage just a member of the clan, had begun to harbour ambitions of usurping Jaden as leader. Alongside Scott Anderson, Dana Cooper and Charity Kesey, Ferrell formed a breakaway group, setting the stage for the tragic sequence of events that would later unfold. It was November 1996 when 14-year-old Heather Wendorf, who had been befriended by Ferrell, unwittingly became entangled in the web of the Murray vampire clan. Heather had been having difficulties in the relationship with her parents, and like many adolescents, felt persecuted by them. Heather likely saw the Murray vampire clan as a means of rebellion and dissent. Described as credulous by her boyfriend at the time, Heather's interest in the clan's ideology proved fatal. The Murray vampire clan were more than edgy. There had been rumours that Rod Ferrell was responsible for breaking into a local animal shelter and mutilating puppies in order to drink their blood. Yet Heather still willingly accompanied Rod and his cohorts when they arrived one day to collect her. Heather had asked Ferrell to help her escape life with her parents, claiming they were abusive and were making her life hell. Heather Wendorf would later claim that she had no part or knowledge of the crimes that would later occur. What followed was a night of horror, leaving behind both a bloody crime scene and the lifeless bodies of Heather's parents, Richard and Naomi Wendorf. The clan fled to New Orleans in search of sanctuary. However, their plans were foiled when they ran out of money, and one of the girls made a desperate phone call to her grandmother seeking funds and exposing the clan's whereabouts to the authorities. In the aftermath, Ferrell's lack of remorse was palpable. Proud of his actions, he viewed himself as the epitome of criminality. At trial in 1998, Ferrell faced the full weight of justice, receiving the death penalty. Heather Wendorf, however, escaped conviction, her innocence clouded by conflicting testimonies and allegations of abuse. As Ferrell's sentence was commuted due to his age, questions lingered about the true nature of the crimes committed. Was it a descent into madness fueled by delusions of grandeur, or a calculated act of violence born from a twisted ideology? Ferrell himself has said that the crimes were really nothing to do with the belief in vampirism. They were committed as Heather had made an allegation of her parents abusing her. Whatever the truth, the saga of the Murray vampire clan serves as a stark reminder of the thin line between fantasy and reality, and the devastating consequences of unchecked belief. So that was the case of Rod Ferrell and the Murray vampire clan. My co-host Marcus is going to be joining us now for a bit of a discussion. Marcus, how are you?
Well, hello everybody. I am not too bad, thank you. That was a very interesting case. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty well. This is a case that sort of interests me, as we've sort of discussed a little bit previously. I sort of feel this one slightly differently because of the age gap. I'm little bit older than Marcus, quite a bit older than Marcus. And I actually remember being a teenager in the 90s. So Rod Ferrell is the same age as me. He's sort of just a few months older than me. And I can remember sort of growing up in the 1990s as sort of an alternative teen and listening to sort of heavy metal music and how that was sort of portrayed at the time, and the sort of hysteria and the worry around what teenagers were up to and what sort of things were influencing them back in the 1990s. So this case in particular, this sort of like the Merry Vampire Clan, I would sort of put it on a par with another case that's perhaps a lot more well-known, a lot bigger, and that would be the West Memphis 3. Again, sort of that took place in the 1990s in the heart of sort of Bible Belt America. And again, we see sort of like satanic panic and everything that was happening there. And I kind of feel this is sort of adjacent to all of that. I mean, I'd be interested to hear sort of what you think about that, because obviously this is something that to you, not having lived it, not having sort of remembered sort of that as it went down, it's interesting to sort of hear sort of your take on it.
So with the West Memphis 3, as we talked about yesterday, I did not know too much about it. Having done a little bit of research, it seems like Damien Eccles, the sort of main guy that I can see from what I've read, he was sentenced to death while his counterpart Jesse was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 20 years. And then Jason Baldwin, who seemed to have the least to do with it, was obviously imprisoned for a shorter period, still life, but a shorter period. And it kind of feels like they were almost scapegoats for this case. There seems like there's a lot of evidence, but there's a lot of counter evidence. And
yeah,
it becomes an interesting thing where it's like, you know, we talked about it with, I don't want to drop too many names here, but we talked about it with Richard Allen too, with the documents that have just come out yesterday. We talked about it yesterday with the documents that have recently come out about how, you know, he's trying to get certain things stricken from record because he believes, strictly speaking, they're not true. It seems like there's a lot of like scapegoat kind of things going on here, whereas with the case today, Rod Ferrell, he very much outwardly and openly admitted his involvement and made it like a brag, as opposed to being like, oh well, I kind of fit the profile. Like, he was there and he did it, and he made everybody aware of that.
Yeah, there's no question as to sort of whether he did it. I suppose it's interesting to me in the parallels that there are in sort of like a group of teens that have sort of gone astray or been led astray, potentially, regardless of whether or not they've committed the crime. So obviously in Rob Ferrell's case, he did commit the crime. The West Memphis 3 is broadly believed. I mean, there are some people still on the fence, but obviously they took an Alford plea. They have been released now, but broadly people sort of all came together, and the people in the music industry, musicians, I think Pearl Jam, Metallica, there was this huge campaign to sort of get them freed, with the idea being that you just can't persecute kids because they enjoy sort of particular media, just because kids sort of a bit of a misfit and listening to heavy metal doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be committing crimes. And I suppose in the case of the West Memphis 3, for the sake of argument, say they've not done it, they've been unfairly persecuted for this crime, and then sort of the state over happening in the 90s around the same time, you've got Rod Ferrell and the Murray Vampire Clan, and a similar situation, some misfit kids that are into sort of spooky things, gothic things, vampires, this Vampire the Masquerade, which I'm given to, we'll chat about that a bit more in a minute, but I'm given to understand that that's like a tabletop role-playing game, something like Dungeons and Dragons, or what's the other one called? Magic the Gathering? Is it something like that, but vampire based? I don't know, not my area of expertise. But yeah, Magic so they were all sort of steeped in that. Sorry, I missed that.
Magic the Gathering is a card game. That was my particular brand of nerd when I was like 18 to 20, 30.
Yeah, so you're not completely sort of like in the dark about this. So it's basically, groups of teenagers will get together and they will have their sort of like their little identity, and that will be often sort of built around sort of whatever it is that they're consuming sort of in popular culture or in media at the time. And like we were saying before, that the 90s in America, in the Bible Belt, and across the world really, that there was the notion of satanic panic that's obviously been sort of like widely covered. And we were saying, like, looking back on this now, in the 90s when I was a teenager growing up, we had satanic panic. We also had in the UK, we had the case of Jamie Bolger and the hysteria around the so-called video nasties, and whether or not like watching horror films or playing violent video games was going to sort of drive you to commit murder. So I kind of find it interesting that this is sort of dropped down in the context of all of that, but I just thought it was an interesting talking point. And I don't know a massive amount about Bible Belt America, apart from it's the South America, not South America, the American South, different thing. And it's sort of quite religious, sort of. Was it you that said to me it's evangelical? Like, it's Christian. Carry on.
Yeah, well, while we're on topic, just because it was easy, I have the Wikipedia description of the Bible Belt in front of me.
Okay.
So it says, again, this is Wikipedia, so it is subject to a certain amount of change, but the Bible Belt is a region of the southern United States and one Midwestern state, which is the state of Missouri, in all of which socially conservative Protestant Christianity plays a strong role in society. Church attendance across the denominations is greatly higher than the national average. The region contrasts with the religiously diverse Midwest and Great Lakes and the Mormon corridor in Utah, southern Idaho, and northern Arizona. So it very much seems like, yes, the evangelical influence is strong in northern Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, like the sort of more, I don't want to say well-known, but we are English, so the more well-known sort of places. But yeah, the earliest known usage of the term Bible Belt was by the American journalist and social commentator H.L. McKinnon, apparently, in 1924. So that's what Wikipedia has to say on the subject.
Well, there you go. See, I can sort of see how it would happen if I were a teenager at that time, if I was living somewhere that was very conservative, very religious. I could see how, if you're a teen and you're hanging out with your mates and you're sort of kicking back against that, I could see how you sort of go in the opposite direction. You go into sort of like occultism, Satanism, vampires, heavy metal music. I think it's a sort of fairly straightforward sort of line from one thing to the other if you're trying to sort of rebel against your parents or just going through your sort of like adolescent nonsense that we all go through.
Sure,
I was thinking as well, like again, we're in the 90s here, and I was thinking about the other sort of media that these kids would have consumed at the time, and all the films that came out then, like obviously Bram Stoker's Dracula came out round about that time. I'm going to look that up because I did have, was it 1991 Bram Stoker's Dracula? Let's have a look. No, 1992. I was wrong. So Bram Stoker's Dracula was out in 1992. The actual film Interview with the Vampire as well was out. There was like a little flurry of vampire films that all came out sort of in the 90s. Interview with the Vampire
94.
was 1994. Oh yeah, 94. I'm saying as well, Lost Boys, that would have been a little bit earlier.
Lost Boys
was 1987. So yeah, late 80s, sort of early 90s, there was sort of like a good time for vampire films. So it was sort of very much sort of present in the culture at that time. And I was thinking as well, the actual books, because when the Merry Vampire Clan, once Rod Ferrell has committed this crime and he's gone back to the other kids that are in the car, and they've gone to New Orleans, and it made me think, I never pronounced that properly. Is it New Orleans or New Orleans? Do you know? Do we know?
I've heard that pronounced. It's New Orleans, New Orleans, and New Orleans.
New Orleans sounds
the much more Americanized version of it.
I know.
They're on TV.
I'm sure somebody American would be perfectly willing to correct me on my pronunciation of it. But the Anne Rice vampire books, I don't know. I haven't read any of them for a very long time, but I think I remember reading them as a teenager, the Anne Rice books, and also the because she did the vampire books, but she did the books on witches as well. And I remember the witches ones being set in the American South, so I can't remember where Interview with the Vampire was set, but I've got a feeling it might have been in that sort of geographic area as well, which I found interesting. So it just makes me wonder. I can picture it because I was there at the time, sort of, albeit in England in the 1990s, but I can just imagine sort of like, I mean, I didn't go getting myself in a vampire clan and murdering anyone, but I can see how it happens. Yeah, so we've got Interview with the Vampire. I can't think of any other vampire films that were out at the time. Can you, off the top of my head? So we Interview with the Vampire, Bram Stoker's Dracula, Lost Boys. When was From Dusk Till Dawn? That would have been another one, wasn't it?
That was 96. I'm just gonna I'm at my.
Are we guessing? Let's Dusk Till Dawn. Yes, 1996.
Yeah.
10 points for Marcus. Look, yeah. So looking back on it, it hadn't occurred to me, but like looking back on it, that sort of vampires were a big thing in like early 90s sort of alternative culture. There was a lot of films coming out, there were a lot of books coming out, and I can't remember sort of another time where it was as prominent as that. So yeah, it does. This game though, I know Rod Ferrell's mother, we were talking about his mum, and she has introduced him to this game, and allegedly his mum as well, I think, separate, and this is again separate completely to Rod Ferrell's own crimes, but it does speak to sort of his mother's character and the person he was raised by. She was actually charged with soliciting to commit rape of a 14-year-old boy because she had written a load of letters to the teenager. Whether or not he was one of Rod Ferrell's friends, whether or not it was within the same peer group, I don't actually know. I couldn't find out any information. But she had been writing some sort of pretty weird and saucy letters to a 14-year-old boy that were about this weird vampire game. So yeah, not having played it, I couldn't possibly comment, but yeah, it just seems a bit peculiar. And yeah, I've never been, and again, don't come for me, I'm sure there are people among our listeners who are big fans of tabletop role-playing games. It's not something I've ever sort of played. Sort of, I've been like on the outskirts, I've known people who play it, but it's difficult for me to sort of understand how consuming that can become. I suppose it's, again, it was a different time. There weren't sort of necessarily kids, sort of people weren't chronically online like they are now, and I think this was something we were sort of discussing as well, like today's kids, there doesn't seem to be sort of quite the same hysteria over what media they're consuming as there was sort of back in the 1990s. You had people who were sort of panicking about video nasties, like I said before, and satanic panic, things like that. But nowadays you've got teenagers, they've got the entire world of like internet hideousness at their fingertips from quite a young age. So it's almost like it's so broad now that nobody's sort of expressing any concern about sort of particular things like they might have done back in the 1990s.
I think you're kind of onto something there. I think it's really easy for us to say, oh well, we don't have to deal with this because we know how to put blocks on our phone or to remove apps or whatever. But when it comes down to what life was like back then and the expectations for teenagers as well, I mean, particularly within America, there's I don't want to sort of stereotype here, but there's a heavy sports thing going on. There's a heavy, if you're not in a band, you're on the football field. If you're not in a football field, and everybody had this thing where they had to be put in a box. And if you're not in a box, what do? You create one. You create one that fits around you. And I think that's potentially how a lot of these things happen. People mirror the things they see within the media, the things they see on the TV, because it's the only thing that makes sense to them, because they're told that they have to be in a box. I don't like to overuse the same point, but essentially, yeah, they're told they have to fit in somewhere. And unfortunately, when it comes to things like people dealing with heavy trauma at a young age, they don't know how to respond to typical teenage movements, social cues, everything like that. So they sort of mix in with other people from the same ilk that end up in this category of misfits. And I think that creates this issue.
I think sort of kids these days, it's a lot easier to sort of find your tribe or whatever the expression would be. But like I can remember sort of being exactly this type of teen, like in the early 90s, exactly this type of teen, aside from the fact that I didn't murder anyone, but yeah, being into the heavy metals, sort of consuming that type of media, reading those books. I remember if you went out and bought like an issue of Kerrang or Raw, or back when there were magazines, God, back when we worked with stone tools and read magazines.
And that was like the best thing ever. Like Metal Hammer was like this epic magazine. I don't want to get tangential here. You carry on, sorry.
Yeah, but I remember reading sort of Kerrang magazine, and there was a huge thing at the time about Varg Vikernes, the lad from Burtham, who was convicted of murder, wasn't he? But didn't he burn down a church or something?
That was like in Finland as well. Like the nicest
was it
place.
Norway? Was it
Norway?
Finland or Norway? Yeah, I think it was like Norwegian black metal. But I remember there was sort of like a big hoo-ha about Norwegian black metal in particular because of Varg Vikernes, and he'd been convicted of murder. He burnt down a church. Again, there was a lot of hysteria with, I think it was specifically with Marilyn Manson within the West Memphis 3 case. I couldn't get my words out then. Yeah, there was hysteria, particularly about particular figures and particular media. And yeah, I just find that fascinating, and I find it so sort of, yeah, it's very much takes me back to my youth, sort of reading about it all.
That's fair.
Just have a look and see what my other talking points were. So yeah, we were talking about his mum and the type of woman she was. Obviously not great, obviously sort of was abusing or attempting to abuse potentially one of Rod Ferrell's peers, although it's not mentioned. The name of the person that she sent these letters to isn't mentioned, but yeah, so he's not had the best upbringing. So I think you can see sort of from that you could go a bit wrong if that's your mum and she's got you. And again, he'd never admitted to sort of being physically abused by like his grandparents, although from what I gather there were rumours out there that he had undergone some sort of physical sexual abuse from people in his life as a young child. As like I said to you before, I was actually planning on looking at all of the vampire killers I've got sort of 3 or 4 cases to go through, and I was going to have a look at them in terms of both sort of the culture and time at which they occurred, what that can tell us about them. But is there anything other than that sort of links these cases? What is it about sort of vampirism in a way that people who are troubled, people who are going to commit crimes in that particular vein, what are the common denominators here? And I was like looking at it, I'm thinking, okay, nature, nurture, what are their parents like? So yeah, Rod Ferrell, his mum's not great. I was thinking again about the McDonald triad, our good old favourite, the McDonald triad, and whether or not Rod Ferrell displayed sort of anything from that. I know that there were sort of indicators that he'd broken into like a pet shelter or a pet rescue place or something, or a pet store, and he like murdered some puppies or mutilated some puppies or something, which is absolutely horrible. But I think he was already that sort of early doors. I mean, so say from sort of like 15, 16, he's involved with this vampire clan, and obviously they are engaging in presumably consensual, if it can be consensual at that age, bloodletting, blood sharing amongst their peers. And he then is the one to take it that step further. He's the one that goes, all right, okay, I'm going to go and harm some animals. Whether or not, I mean, I'm guessing we could include that within the McDonald triad.
Yeah. You're talking about consensual age now. I just realized that because it's not, this is probably going to get some people are going to be mad at me for this, but because it's not what would be considered the norm or even
Yeah,
potentially considered sexual, is there a legal age? Or is
I
it
would
just a legal age in
assume
which
that
somebody could make a decision as an adult by which that changes in too many different places?
I
That's a
would I would
really interesting point.
I would assume that sort of like self-mutilation or self-harm or bloodletting, regardless of whether it's consensual between peers, I would assume that that's a safeguarding concern. Like looking at it with sort of my adult hat on, I was like, if you've got a bunch of 14 and 15-year-olds who are sort of exchanging blood in whatever format, I'm pretty sure that that's kind of not okay, or is, I don't know if it's specifically illegal, but I imagine that we're adults to find out about this if they're sort of in charge of a group of kids. If say the teacher in school gets wind of this, I'm pretty sure that there'd be sort of some sort of consequences for it. But they seem to have been sort of like largely unchecked, and they seem to be sort of, they've started doing this around sort of 15, 16, and then I think, was he 17 at the time the crimes were committed? Don't know, have to go back and check on that. But yeah, so the McDonald triad with Rod Ferrell, I can't find anything specifically as to when he started or whether he was sort of harming animals sort of earlier in life prior to him getting involved with this particular clan, this particular group of friends. But he does make reference to having witnessed things or witnessed sacrifices and rituals committed by his mother's circle of friends. So the adults in his life were doing some sort of rituals, but that's not there. It's kind of adjacent to. I mean, in terms of the rest of the McDonald triad, I can't find anything that suggests that he has any of those behaviours. I've not found anything about the bedwetting. He doesn't seem to have committed arson at all. It's just the cruelty to animals on that one occasion, which technically he it's different in America, isn't it? Because over here, sort of, when are you considered an adult? Is it 16 or 18?
In America, 21. Here, I
Yeah, in
believe
America, 21.
it's
So whether or not
16.
they would technically consider that to be part of the McDonald triad, I don't know. But yeah,
I
I
don't
thought that
know.
was.
Isn't that from like 14 to 17 or something really obscure like that? It's a very small
I thought
window.
it was like early childhood, but what are they classifying as, like as in at some sort of developmental stage? Whereas like if your child at sort of 2 or 3 is like mutilate. I remember somebody watching some interview where they said, "Oh, my first concerns about my child was when I found him like gathering up frogs and taking them up onto the balcony and throwing them off to see if they'd splat." Who
As
was
much as
that?
I don't want to laugh at that, it's just the abstract thought of
Yeah,
somebody thinking that that sentence is
I
okay.
can't
Like,
remember
what?
what what case it was. I've got a feeling it might be. No, it might have been Paris Bennett, but don't quote me on that because I'm not sure. But yeah, that kind of thing. So like if a child very early on is showing a propensity to want to harm animals, that can be sort of like a warning factor for later life, according to the McDonald triad. But I would sort of say that if you've got to sort of 15, 16 and then you start doing it, I don't know if that, even though technically on paper you're not an adult, I don't know if it's classed in the same way, because it's more of a developmental thing. Does that make sense?
I think one thing we have to think of is the McDonald triad is somewhat subjective. The age parameters actually just suggest childhood. So we have to think, would that actually be a factor within the case? Because although he was marked in his adolescent state, but which we can assume based on the fact that his life in prison sentence that he now has was commuted from the death penalty. So we have to wonder if we can even base the McDonald triad within this theory. Yes, he exhibits one of the 3 signs, but we have no concrete evidence on the rest. Sarah, what do you think about this?
Well, I'm thinking, I suppose, from my point of view, when I've looked at doing sort of vampire killers, I know that there are sort of 3 or 4 cases that I'm interested in looking at. And I'm just wondering about what are the commonalities in these cases. Is there anything specifically that we can take a hold of and use as a lens to view them through that's going to sort of point us out sort of to the common features? The only thing I can come up with is the McDonald triad so far. And yeah, Rod Ferrell maybe at a push can be considered to have displayed one factor of the McDonald triad in that he did harm animals sort of prior to his crimes, but that was when he was a teenager rather than a young child. But yeah, in terms of the other cases I'm looking at, they are all quite different, but they do have this sort of like overarching theme of like obsession with vampires. The case I was going to look at next week, bit closer to home, is Matthew Hardman, and that's a case of a teenage boy in North Wales, I believe it was. And again, very fixated on particular sort of like literature, particular sort of stories of vampires, lots of stuff found in his home sort of that pertains to that. But it's not always the case. One of the other cases that I was going to look at was Tracy Wigginton, which is known as the lesbian vampire killer. So that was an Australian case back in 1989. Again, not an awful lot of common ground with the other ones, so there tends to be sort of quite specific factors. And again, the biggest one I think that, or the one that I found the most fascinating, that I think I'm going to look at and probably finish the little series in, is Richard Chase. And the case of Richard Chase, although he is known as a vampire killer, quite different. There's a lot of different things going on there. There's schizophrenia, mental illness. Richard Chase, his psychology was quite different to the other killers, in that he had sort of a pre-existing mental illness and felt that he needed blood to survive. So he had a genuine belief, like a genuine sort of like mania belief that he needed blood to survive. But that was very much cased in sort of pre-existing schizophrenia. There are other cases as well where there's been elements of sort of sexual sadism. So there doesn't seem to be anything overarching these cases apart from the relation to sort of this vampire mythos. And they're all sort of different and they're all fascinating in their own way, which is why I sort of chose to do the topic. But yeah, that's a little look there on what will be coming up for the rest of these series. If anyone has any other cases that they can think of that might sort of be adjacent to or sort of tie in with this, I would be interested in hearing back from our listeners about it, because yeah, once I've got into it, it is quite fascinating, and there doesn't seem to be sort of, I can't find like a collective sort of subgenre of vampire killers that anyone specifically looked at and written about all in one go. There's quite a lot of writing about Richard Chase. He was sort of quite an interesting case, I think, in terms of whether or not he could be deemed sort of guilty by reasons of insanity and so on and so forth, because his crimes are actually pretty horrific. All of the crimes are pretty horrific in their own way. But yeah, I'd be very much interested if anyone else knows of any vampire killers, because I'm sure that there are more. And I think as well, it kind of ties into, I was wondering, do I tie it into cannibalism? Is that sort of adjacent to sort of like this vampire killers, like people who were sort of like seeking blood, people that are seeking to eat people as well? I didn't know whether to include them. So yeah, it's a broad strokes at the moment, but yeah, it'd be interesting to hear some feedback from our listeners on what sorts of things they'd like to hear us discuss. But I think that probably brings us to a close for Rod Ferrell and the Murray Vampire Clan. As always, let us know what you think of the episode. Let us know if there's anything that you'd like to contribute, or anything that you know that we may have missed. Marcus, what did you want to speak about? What episode you're going to do next, or are you going to save it as a surprise?
So from me, it's interesting in LinkedIn. You talk about how these people obviously share this commonality within the vampirism, and that can encapsulate and stem in so many different directions. And I'm sat here thinking about the mentality of these kind of people. And that brings me on to Brian Cohey. Now, I don't want to get too much into the episode descriptors or anything that actually happens, but if you get a chance to watch the camera footage of Brian Cohey's first interview with the police, where they ask him what he found, what they might find in his closet, the way in which his face changes, the way in which everything around him, his entire aura, seems to become this, yeah, you found my dark secret, but guess what? I kind of like that. There's a certain resemblance within this case. He seems to be almost bragging and demonstrating that he was able to take a life and he was able to do this, and it makes me so powerful that I can do this thing. So that, yeah, brings me on to the case of Brian Cohey, which will be coming very soon. And all I'm really going to say is do yourself a favor and don't eat before you listen to the episode, or during the episode, in fact, because parts of it get quite gross. So, with that, we have, in fact, been Panopticon. And my co-host Sarah has very eloquently... Sorry, there was a noise outside. I will edit this out. My co-host Sarah has very eloquently worded her speech tonight, and yeah, following on from that, if you guys have anything you want us to look into, or if you have any questions, or even if you want to tell us that maybe we missed something and we need to revisit that within any of our episodes, please feel free. And as with everything, our description is full of links to our little projects and to any case material you might want to find. So please like and subscribe and follow us for more. And yeah.
Have we got a link to our Facebook group or our Facebook page in the episode? We can do that, can't we? You can put a link in if it's not already there. But yeah, I will put some images up on the Facebook page as well, because there's some quite interesting sort of photographs of Ferrell when he was arrested, and some prior to his arrest as well. There's some, slightly disturbing, slightly strange photographs that were taken of him that are worth a look at, worth a discussion. So check us out on there as well. But thank you for listening, and take care of yourselves, and we will see you next week.
Thank you guys, take care, and goodbye.